All right, good to go.
Okay, so today I decided that, I wanted to do a talk on diffusion models because I think their diffusion model has been popping up recently in a lot of work, and they're pretty interesting neural network or pretty interesting model that are used in a lot of generative AI applications. So I thought I'd take the time to, understand it and try to explain it to you guys as best as I can. And the paper I'm doing is called Denoising Diffusion Probabilistic Models. I think it's from Berkeley. So just on the agenda today, I'm going to start off with some applications of diffusion models. Just go into a brief introduction about what is actually is a deep diffusion model, what they're used for, some background about Markov chains, which is probability, and then the forward process, reverse process, and then some examples of model architectures where diffusion models are used. Okay, so, oops, I skipped the slides, but I guess to start off, what is actually a diffusion model? So a diffusion model is a class of generative models. So this means that they kind of like generate stuff. So you can imagine like ChatGPT, you tell it to give it a prompt and then it generates some text. Or um, I'm not sure if you guys have tried like Meta AI, but you can tell Meta AI to generate a picture of something and it'll do it. And they're based off Markov chains, which is a probabilistic model. And compared to other types of generative models, such as generative adversarial networks, which are hard to train, but they have good quality, or variance autoencoders. So these are easy to train, but they have low quality. Low quality diffusion model. Yes, Alex?
Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you. I had a question actually about Markov chains in this context. Uh, so
Correct.
I know a little bit about Markov chains. They're basically a chain of probabilities that end up making a sequence of probabilities, and you're trying to maximize the probability along that chain. Would
Mhm.
each pixel in an image be a node in that chain?
Yes, so I'll get to that
Oh, perfect. We'll
later.
get to that.
Yes, yes. Yeah. And but from from what I read, diffusion models, they're easy to train and they also offer good quality results. So that's why they've kind of taken over as the state of the art. And diffusion models, they consist of two steps. So the first step is diffusion, given the name. So basically, you kind of gradually add noise to the data until it becomes like something that is unrecognizable or pure noise. So in this image, it's kind of the forward arrow from left to right. You have this picture of a cat, and then slowly it gets blurred out until it's a bunch of random pixels. And then you have this denoising, where the model is actually trained on this part step is to learn how to recover some data from something that is just noise. So that's the uh, error or the series going from right to left. And some like applications of the models, which I've touched upon, they're used in autonomous driving for two things. So one main thing is computer vision, um, which is having like these cameras and then generating some sort of the surrounding objects or cars based off these images, or using some sort of or generating like a 3D point cloud where you have like LiDAR sensors and you kind of want to know what's around you. So that these are two applications of diffusion models in autonomous driving. I'm sure everyone knows this DAL E2 model from ChatGPT or from OpenAI, where you can give it like a text prompt saying like generate this picture for me, and it'll give you some sort of image that you want. And they're also used in a lot of other computer vision tasks not related to autonomous driving. And one example is like medical imaging or classification. Diffusion models are also really good at enhancing like a existing image or video, which is shown on the right, where you have this kind of low resolution picture of a kid, and then it becomes higher resolution, or the features become more prominent. And those are some things diffusion models are good for. Okay, so background. So I guess to before where we actually kind of dig deeper into diffusion models, um, you need some you need to understand what Markov chains are. So a Markov chain is a finite discrete state space, so consisting of many uh, arbitrary amount of states, and each state is often for a specific time, where as you see, you can go from x1 to xt. T represents which time period this state relates to. And a Markov chain consists of a transition matrix of probabilities. And this is just the probability of transition from one state to another state. And also an initial state distribution. And it's a stochastic process, which means that the states change randomly over time. And an um, important Markov property that diffusion models use and Markov chains use, or of a Markov chain, is that the next state that you're going to, it only should depend on your current state and not any states that have occurred before. So that's the Markov property. Okay, so diffusion models, they consist of two steps. As we said, it was the forward process and the reverse process. So in the forward process, it's relatively simple. Um, what we do is you take some sort of data and you slowly add Gaussian noise to the chosen data, um, and until it becomes unrecognizable or you've added enough noise where the data is random. Um, so this is the equation on the bottom left. So as you can see, because it's a Gaussian distribution and that's dependent on the time, um, every every time step you add some sort of noise. And as t goes to infinity, eventually your distribution becomes isotropic. And this is just like a fancy word for the noise is equally distributed, or it's um, the variance is equal in all directions. And I'll try to explain this equation on the left as best as I can. So what is this saying is that the conditional probability that, the probability that your state x of t is due to the state before is based off this Gaussian distribution, where the mean and variance are, square root 1 minus beta t and of the previous state, and the variance is beta t times the identity matrix. So this beta is actually a hyperparameter of a diffusion model. Um, and it's kind of and it changes based off time. And this hyperparameter you can kind of choose. So maybe at time zero, it's a really small number, and then it gradually increases with when time increases. And in the original diffusion paper, authors actually choose like a linear schedule. I know of other schedules that also exist, such as cosine. But in the paper, they chose a linear schedule, which goes from values of 0.001 to 0.02. And BET is usually a hyperparameter, but it can also be a learnable parameter. Um, and if you guys have any questions, let me know if that didn't make sense.
I just have a quick
Um,
question. So you said
yeah,
probability of capital or vector x sub t given x of t minus 1. Is this basically saying the next pixel, like the probability that the pixel will remain the same color, let's say, is given by that normal distribution for each pixel in the whole image?
you can think of it like that. There's many approaches.
Oh, right, of course.
Yeah, that's one approach. So it's basically the probability that if you have an image and it's made of like three channels RGB and 256 pixels per color, you can kind of model this as the data or the value of the next pixel in the next state for this time is dependent on the current one and only the current one based off some sort of Gaussian distribution um, probability.
I see.
Yeah. And also, to kind of find the probability that you can go from state x0 to a state of x2 or x4 or xt, it is determined by the bottom right. It's the cumulative product of the probabilities of for one transition state. So let's say I'm going from state x1 to x2, x3 to x4. I would have to multiply the probability of going to x2 from x1 times the probability of going from x3 to x2, and then going from x4 from x3. So you can kind of try to kind of model this in some sort of picture format. So we have these states x0 and they go to xt. So at x0, we have this picture of this guy. Um, the image is very clear. And then as slowly as t increases, the image gets blurred more and more and more. And that's this forward process. There's no training done in the forward process. This is kind of all predetermined by some sort of hyperparameters. And one of the hyperparameters is that beta, which, the model developer would choose or find out what's the best value when they're training their model. Okay, and there's this thing called direct sampling where, um, as I mentioned before, the cumulative product, this bottom right, you need to compute the probabilities for every state transition till xt, which means this is like a serial computation. It's iterative, and this takes a lot of time. Um, but you can do something called direct sampling where you can compute x of t directly from the initial state. And this is just done by a reparameterization of a couple of variables. So now we have alpha t, and that's equal to 1 minus beta t. And then we have this other alpha t, which is the cumulative product of all the alphas from 1 to that time frame. And doing this, we can get this nice normal distribution formula to calculate the probability of x at t given an initial state um, using these formulas. Let me know if that doesn't make sense. I can try to explain it again. But it's just the same formulas with a little bit of reparameterization. Yeah. So that's the forward process. And the reverse process is what the model actually learns. So going backwards from x of t back to x of 0, um, how can we transition from a state of pure noise to the initial state where it's a clear image or a data sample from the data set. And that's modeled by this P theta equation, where we can get the previous state from the current state, not the next state from the current state, the previous state. Yes, how do we transition? And what the reverse process does is, given a Gaussian noise input, we want to find the reverse Markov transitions that recreate the true data sample. Actually, and because this is all, probability formulas from Gaussian, there's um, there's a derivation where you can actually calculate every single transition, but that's actually a very computationally expensive, so no one actually does that. Uh, so what diffusion models do, or what they're actually trained to do, is they're trained to predict the amount of Gaussian noise that's added at a certain time to go between two states. So let's say I'm going from the second image to the third image. My diffusion model would predict how much Gaussian noise did I add to the second image here to get to the third. And then on the reverse, we can use the model to predict the opposite, which is going from image or the third image to the second. And the derivation, I'm not going to try to go into too much detail about it because it's very complicated. If anyone wants to learn more, I can kind of direct them to the sources. But it's based on three formulas, or three things. So because this diffusion model is based off a Markov chain and the probability of transitioning from one state to another is a Gaussian distribution, what we need to do is we need to predict um, we need to predict the amount Gaussian noise. And if we have the amount Gaussian noise, we can find or compute the mean and the variance for the Gaussian distribution. And using that, we can find the conditional probability of the state before. So this epsilon theta, this is predicted by the model, highlighted by the blue. And then the bottom two formulas are will compute the variance and the mean. So for the variance, once again, beta t is a hyperparameter, which is stable, it's not trained. And that's dependent on it's dependent on an equation that, the model developer chooses. Alpha t is kind of just a reformulation or reparameterization using beta t. So these are all constants. So we can calculate the variance in that way. Um, Mean, we will need to use the epsilon, and we can calculate it using this equation. And using these two variance and mean, we can use the first equation where we can calculate the conditional probability of the state before given the current state with the initial state distribution. And this is the diffusion model architecture. Oh, and before I go on to the next slide. So how the model is trained is um, given this prediction for this model, we want to kind of see that, oh, how close are we to the actual Gaussian noise? And that's kind of determined usually from the paper, that's determined from a mean squared error of just the log loss between the predicted and the actual epsilon value. And now onto the model architecture. So diffusion models generally use two types of model architectures. They either use a transformer or they use this thing called the U-net. So a U-net is, well, from its name, it's a U-like shaped, and I think they're used mainly for CNNs or like ResNet uses this architecture. And the main reason diffusion models use two types of architectures is because in both models, the size of the input and the size of the output are equal. So you're not losing data and you're not making more or creating more data. So a U-net is composed of three parts. So the contracting path, which is the encoder, that consists of convolution layers, activation and pooling functions, and feature doubling. And then you have the expansive path, which is the decoder, which takes the encoded information and then decodes it. It consists of conv layers or upsampling. And then we have skip connections where there's like direct paths from an encoder to a decoder. And these exist because sometimes you don't want to lose the features that are, you don't want to lose the features that get encoded when you're passing them through encoder layers. So when you go from an encoder to directly to a decoder, you can kind of still keep those important features that you might need for your model. And I tried to go into a detail about like how we can use the U-net for an image generation or an example. So once again, the diffusion model, what it actually predicts is just the noise, which it calculates the noise that is added from one state to another. And this is used to calculate the mean and variance for a given time. And using that mean and variance, you can get the Gaussian distribution, which is the probabilities that you need to go from one state to another. And in the paper, what the authors did is, this is going back to your question, Alex. So for each pixel in the RGB channels, what they do is they scale the values from 0 to 255 to -1 to 1. And then once these pixels are scaled, they kind of integrate over the Gaussian distribution for each scale pixel value. And that's for the limits of these two are shown below. And so once the model predicts the noise at a certain time, you take the cumulative product of the probabilities of every pixel. So that's what it's doing. And doing that, you get this probability of going from one state to the other. So it's kind of summing up the probabilities for each pixel. I'm not sure if that answers your question, Alex.
It does. It does very well. My another thing I'm curious on is does the probability that pixel, let's say pixel 5, had noise added to it, does that depend on any other pixels according to the math, or is the math independent along the pixels?
Okay, yeah, so that's a good question. Um, so in terms of the UNet architecture, it doesn't actually take into account, you know, the relative position of a pixel to another pixel. So actually the noise is added equally to every pixel.
That's
Um,
really interesting.
yes. So that's why there's this other, so that's kind of going to my next slide where um, UNet is good, but it kind of lacks some things. And one of these things is that UNet treats every pixel equally, despite its location in the image, right? Maybe like if you have, um, I don't know, maybe if we go back to this cat photo, the pixels that are corresponding to the cat might be more important than the background. So that's what transformers do, or the diffusion models with a transformer architecture do. So a transformer, um, I can go to a background with the architecture transformer, but why they're so good is because they can model long range dependencies, and they also capture information about relative positions of data. So in terms of like a text, words that are closer together, they might be more related compared to words that are farther apart. That's why we use transformers for NLP, natural language processing. Um, and what you would do with the image to, get it, have it, have it be able to use for a transformer is you would take those pixels of the image and you would tokenize the spatial image. So just from a quick background readings, what I found was they would treat like a 2 by 2 grid or pixel grid of an image, and they would tokenize that 2 by 2 grid. Then they would go to the next 2 by 2 grid in the image, and they would tokenize that, and they would give that to the transformer so that it can capture or learn about the data. And again, the transformer, all it does, or what diffusion models do, is they predict the noise that's added from a state to another state, which is then used to calculate the uh, conditional probabilities using the Gaussian distribution. Yeah, and that kind of concludes my talk. Does anyone have any questions?
First of all, thank you so much for the talk. So just kind of like just to repeat back at you to make sure I understand this, because I find this really interesting. I always
Yeah.
thought the U model was the only model. I didn't think transformers were in there. So you're saying that the conditional probability was only based on the cell itself. So if you think about that, doesn't that just put no, like if I tried to, wouldn't that just create a noisy image? So how I understood these models is that we create an encoder and then a decoder. And
Hmm.
then what we do is then we just take the encoder away and all we have is the decoder. And if I give it a random set of noise, it will produce a picture of a cat. I trained it with an encoder decoder that de encodes a picture of a cat into noise and decodes it into a picture of a cat. So now if I just give it random noise, I should get a random picture of a cat. And I always thought the U model was the only model. The fact that it works, because I just find it interesting that it works regardless of the fact that it doesn't understand the pixels around itself. But what does the benefit of the transformer bring in if the U model was working? Does the transformer provide more context for like the edges of the cat, for example?
Yeah, so again, because like the advantages of a transformer is that it can model um, longer long-term dependencies, and then of course it has the attention block where you can kind of model like relative importance of one token or one word to another or one pixel to another. That's why you can, that's why when you use a transformer, it kind of treats pixels differently. So from what I've been read, that kind of leads to more accuracy and better results. Um, and there's a paper about that. It's called Scalable Diffusion Models with Transformers. If anyone was interested as well. Yeah. Andrew?
Yeah, so I was trying to wrap my head around what Alex was just saying. Uh, you basically train it as a decoder, encoder decoder, and then you move away the encoder.
Mhm.
Whatever remains, like, what is the input? Like, is it just like random noise? You just supply random noise, and how do you get from that to basically text to image generation? Like, you have some sort of a large language model or a transformer model that is, I think, understanding the latent representation of the sentence that you described and somehow kind of like guiding this decoder to do something meaningful. Like, this is the part I think of as like black magic. I totally don't get it.
Yes, yes. So I actually spent quite a bit of time trying to understand this. I don't think I understand it like very well, but from what I've been told is, or from what I read is you have this like just noise. And well, when you're training the model, you're training um, how can go from noise to any of the data samples in the data set. Um, and from like a text to image, you'd have some sort of initial state. Um, some sort of initial state that eventually goes to that image that you want. That's like that black magic part, which I don't quite understand yet. So hopefully I can get an answer soon for that.
Okay. And I
Yeah.
think also like what I don't get, like I joined a little bit late, so I don't know if you already talked about that. But if you go back to the slide where you're kind of like showing the forward path, right? You go from x0 up to xt, right?
Yeah.
You mentioned something about like at xt, this is kind of like noise that is kind of like equally distributed noise, right?
Yes.
Um, So if my data set has so many different images of different things, right? And I'm kind of like taking them all to indistinguishable noise that is equally distributed, right? On the backward path, like how do you go from like pure noise to one of those data set? Like what guides you to,
Mhm.
right?
Okay. Yeah. I guess what it does basically is the model kind of just predicts how much noise was added at a particular transition. Um, so I guess if I go to the example of the image, right? Um, so let's say if I'm going from something that's very noisy to the next state, which is less noisy, you know exactly like what the values of the pixels are, or um, for a given for a given like predicted noise, you would integrate, the values of the pixels across the Gaussian distribution. So if this integral is actually very large, that means the probabilities or the predicted noise that you have is actually very close to the original values of the pixel. So the noise that you've predicted is somewhat close to the actual noise that was added in the forward process. So this is how kind of the training or the model knows um, if you've going to a state that's more likely to transition to other states that eventually get to the true data sample.
But I think like I think I understand this for a single image, like going
Mhm.
image to noise and then trying to predict the way backward, right?
Mhm.
I don't think I fully understand it, but I think I understand it for a single image, right? But if I have
Yeah.
like an image of this guy that you were showing and then an image of a cat, right? And I'm taking
Mhm.
both of them to pure noise, right? And then I'm taking away the encoder. How does the decoder know? Like, yeah, still can't wrap my head around it, but maybe I also don't fully understand the math. Uh,
Are you asking this in terms of like a training or in terms of just like going from noise to something that a user wanted?
no, more from like an inference perspective.
Okay. Yeah, that I guess I'm not too quite sure about like just how the model is being run in terms of an inference standpoint, where you don't know if the output is correct. But I guess when you're training the model, you would have a lot of data samples. Um, I guess the model would predict that noise accurately. So once you're, yeah, I guess like in terms of inference standpoint, I can't give you quite a good answer. Um, that's something I actually like searched for a long time, but I could not find a good answer for.
Yeah, my kind of like very vague guess or understanding is that whatever input you provide in the form of text is kind of like guiding the model to predict different distributions of noise, right? But
Mhm.
how do you actually form this link is the part that is quite interesting.
Mhm.
Anyway,
I
uh
assume that you maybe like because you have a bunch of initial states, and maybe these initial states eventually lead to states that are states of the answer you want. So maybe the initial starting point might be different um, for each inference that you want to run.
hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. Thanks for at least like scratching the surface.
Yeah.
It's an interesting topic.
Yeah, I wonder if it's baked into the model somehow. So if you go to the picture of the U-net as an actual U, there are convolutional layers at every part of that U from the left side to the right side, and I wonder if the weights of those convolutional layers somehow encode information that will say that this noise could only be possible if this was a picture of a dog. Because if it was a picture of a cat, then this noise that we're seeing isn't possible. And therefore it's able to infer from pure noise that we are going towards a picture of a cat. That's at least my thought.
That's what I understand is like what's happening is that whatever noise that the model predicts, that should only lead to a certain transition of states.
Right.
Yeah.
And then I think the same thing happens with the transformer model, but with convolutional neural networks, you can only do that with, I believe, images or things that could be thought of as spatial imaging. But I think when you add a transformer into there, I wonder if somehow they pass along that information of like the prompt the user put in, and that will allow it to like, as if you trained it enough, you can actually get this U shape again, but your transformer is aware that the context of what the image was like trained on, where if it says picture of a dog playing in a field, and that was the text that was passed in, that would generate a certain set of noise. And then when you're decoding, you can probably infer that, oh, my context is dog playing in field, this noise would go in this direction. That's my understanding. Does that concur with what you've seen and read?
Yes, that's what like my understanding is.
Mm,
I guess the initial what Andrew asked as the initial, like how do we go from initial state to
yeah,
something is the black box, which the papers do not talk about. They only talk about training.
interesting.
Um, yeah.
Hmm.
Any other questions? Or I guess we can call it for this week then.
I see something
I,
happening.
I was going to say one thing, but I don't know if it's relevant or not. I looked at Meta's Vision LLM uh, a while ago, and it has cross attention, right? So it takes a text input, and and that would go into your attention blocks as cross attention. So that in a transformer-based model anyway, could be a way that you could apply what you were talking about, of how do you have text affecting the output video generation. that the text is going, being processed through part of an LLM, going into a cross-attention layer to the video part.
Mhm.
And, therefore conditioning all the calculations of the noise that's going through there. Now, I didn't read this in enough detail to know for sure, like exactly, and unfortunately, I missed the first part of the presentation, so this is just a thought. I don't know if I'm correct about this at all.
I didn't look in too much into the cross attention, so I can't really speak onto that. And I didn't really look too much into metas specifically, their model.
Yeah, and that makes sense. Like, I guess it's just a thought of that might be a way that some of these video language models are doing it.
Mhm. Yeah.
The paper was, I think, I can't actually remember now how much of it was generation versus captioning and so on. But you, in principle, I guess, could apply it to generation as well as things like captioning, so.
Are there any other questions for Taikun?
I have a question. Alex, will you be posting a video of this?
Yeah, it's recorded, so I'll post the video probably this evening when I get home.
Sounds good. I'm gonna go back and watch the part I missed at a conflicting appointment.
Mhm. That's good.
All right, I'm going to stop
Okay.
the recording.